Well, hello everyone. Glad to be with you again for another Sunday School Teacher Workshop. This week we are on Joshua chapter 7, the disobedience of Achan, sharpening that title just a little bit with the serpent being from the garden enticing Achan. What I hope to do over the course of our time together here is just touch on a few things that I think are important with respect to framing up the story and why it's so important. Of course, that's what we're attempting to try to do with every story that we cover. Many times we're not able to cover everything about the story that makes it important, but we understand that there are multiple layers to just about every story in Scripture. And it would take more than one lesson, no matter how much time we had to spend on it, to really unravel all of that. But helping our students appreciate the progression here that's based off previous patterns is going to, I think, help us appreciate why the Lord allowed for the defeat of Israel at the hands of a very small city, Ai, and why Achan's sin, punished as it was seemingly so severe. So you've heard me argue at times past how Genesis chapters 1 through 3 is something of a microcosm by which stories that follow it can easily be seen against that backdrop. And we can now appreciate how those stories are assembled as they are, the operative parts that are there. When we get past Genesis chapters 1 through 3, and then we move into the story of, say, Noah, while some of this might not be in the exact same sequence here, many of these pieces are. In Genesis chapters 1 through 3, we have creation. We move on to creation culminates in the creation of the image bearers, the coronation of Adam, and then, of course, the installation of Adam into the garden, right? And then after that, we have the fall. So, not taking the time to write all these words out on the screen because that's just going to take too much time together. Rather, just abbreviating this with these letters. So, hopefully, you appreciate what I'm writing there when I write those letters down. If not, just go back to what I said a couple of seconds ago, and I'm basically using the first letter of each of those words, right? So creation, the coronation of Adam, the installation of Adam into the garden, and then the fall. Well, when we get to the story of Noah, we see that creation is about to undergo the exact reverse of what happened in the events of Genesis chapter 1. And it's going to start with God allowing the very thing that he ordered to begin with to allow creation to commence, and that is water coming from both above and below to completely destroy everything. So essentially, we have decreation. And then after we move through that sequence, we have the calling of Noah. But then again, that call actually happened all the way back here, but it pays off at this particular moment because the thing that is calling Noah for is not so much building the ark, but it's taking Adam's place in the new creation, right? But through the whole entire flood sequence, what we do have is God is putting Noah inside the floating Eden. That would be the ark, correct? And then once we get off of the float or out of the floating Eden on the mountainside, now we have the commissioning of Noah, or maybe we could call it the installation of Noah as the new king priest or Adam on the other side of that creation, given the same blessing that Adam was to be fruitful, multiply. God has placed everything under his authority. And then after that, we have Noah's fall, where he becomes drunk and shames himself. And then we could go on and on. I don't want to take more time with using more examples here. But the same would apply to Abraham, and it would take more examples from the story to show how Abraham, in essence, repeats that fall. But when we pick up in Genesis chapter 12, we're right back here with the call of, or I should say, working through the decreation moment of Babylon, and then the move to a new creation moment with the call of Abram. And then, of course, over a sequence of several chapters and stories, his installation. And then there's several moments where he kind of falls in a sense. Some are more egregious than others. But ultimately, we culminate in something of a bright spot without that story leading away from the character of Abraham on a fall, but rather a high moment with him completely demonstrating full faith whenever he offers Isaac in Genesis chapters 22. But point being is that now we're looking at a much larger story sequence, starting here with Joshua, and completely bypassing the many moments when Israel as a nation, Israel as a corporate Adam, has done the same things, but we've walked through those in previous stories. So I would encourage you to go back and look at those videos if you want to brush up on that. Now we're looking at the sequence of Joshua, chapters 1 through 7. And we can slice up this story to essentially see exactly the same sequence almost, because in Joshua chapters 1 through 3, it's Israel moving into the new creation, right? As they had walked through the parted waters of the Jordan, they are essentially recreating, and no pun intended, but recreating the moment when they walked through the Red Sea, leaving Egypt. And now this second act of walking through another parted body of water with Yahweh at the head of the column, previously in fire and cloud as they were walking through the sea, now in his chariot throne of the Ark of the Covenant, borne on the shoulders of priests, into this new creation that Israel is going to follow behind as they walk through the waters, passing the Ark of the Covenant. And now, of course, Yahweh bringing up the rear after the last Israelites pass through, because they are going through this sequence all over again of walking through parted water. The essential weight of what was going on back in Exodus chapter 14 of walking through the Red Sea into that new creation that waits on the other side, leaving Israel behind, or leaving Egypt behind permanently, and having Egypt completely severed from them, is creating all the significance of what's going on here as Israel's walking through the Jordan and now into their new provincial Eden, i.e., Canaan, where the Lord is bringing them. This is their new creation moment. And then it's marked by very similar episodes here in chapters 4 and 5, where we're essentially having in this moment the calling of Israel and their installation almost happening simultaneously. Now, of course, this is not the only moment when we see a call for Israel. We could probably go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12 to see where the call officially begins with the progenitor of this people group, i.e., Abram. But maybe more succinctly as goes this entire nation group of hundreds of thousands. Exodus 19 is the moment when they come up to Mount Sinai and the Lord calls them essentially to be his peculiar people. He's going to form them into a nation, kingdom of priests that are meant to impact the world. But that generation has died, and this new generation is replacing them. In this new generation, while some of them no doubt remember that moment because they were in their late teens, not over the age of 20 yet, which was the line of demarcation for those who perished with the previous generation. They were in their late teens, and they perhaps remember when the Lord descended on Sinai and spoke to them all at the beginning of that previous wilderness wandering. But this new generation, many of whom were actually born out in the wilderness, of course, have a memory of that moment. So this is essentially their call when they are told by their new leader, Joshua, that they are to consecrate themselves because the Lord is going to show up among them and do wonders as he parts the river. And now that they've walked into the river in chapter 5, they're going to be celebrating the Passover. And so with that, essentially as the Passover ignited the exodus out of Egypt, now it's igniting the exodus out of the exile of the wilderness wandering and leading them into the land. Previous Passover brought the final culminating act in the destruction of Egypt by Yahweh in the land of Egypt. Granted, there's the final moment with the crushing of the Egyptians in the Red Sea, sure. But it started the process of their ultimate demise, just like this Passover is going to start the ultimate demise of first the Jerichoites and then all the other Canaanites that will perish after them. And then there is also preserved for us here the fact that all the males have to be circumcised, bringing them into the proper covenant alignment, which essentially is harkening back to the moment of Adam's call when he was taken out of the area outside of the Garden of Eden and then placed in the garden And then, of course, with Genesis chapter 17, when now this sign of circumcision, the sign of the covenant, is given to Abraham to give to all the males that come from his bloodline, because without it, they cannot be considered proper Israelites, Hebrews, right? So with that, it's a mark of that calling. And then, of course, with the various intertwined priestly acts that are going on here in this book. And of course, that even brings us through chapter 6, where we see the destruction of Jericho and the fact that the people are dedicated as haram, but also the inanimate material objects, i.e., gold and silver, iron and bronze, that are all also dedicated to the Lord and given over to Him, will enrich His treasuries for the various things that will come forth, in which that money will have to be hearkened upon. All of these priestly acts, the idea of, let me just back up for a second, make sure I capture this appropriately. I say priestly, I mean giving over of something to Yahweh as an act of worship. That's the role of the priestly class. But this is a kingdom of priests. And what they just did in Jericho, by making sure that every human being was put to the sword, which was Yahweh's command, and all of these other articles were collected up to be put into his treasuries, was also an offering unto the Lord. All of that would be priestly. This, in a sense, is calling back to the installation of the new corporate Adam, and they're executing this priestly role. We call back to Adam in his installation as a priest in Genesis chapter 2, when Adam is told he is going to cultivate or guard, watch, and keep the garden, which, of course, are priestly terms. We've talked about that enough. So anyway, now that we move beyond that into chapter 7, after we get past the installation of Adam into the garden, and now that's exactly where they are. They're in the new province of Eden. They're carrying the portable Garden of Eden with them everywhere they go. They have yet to actually set that up. That will come in chapters later on Joshua. After a few more years have gone by with this battle campaign going on, we can presume that they did not set that up yet, because we have no mention of it being set up anywhere yet until that particular moment. But nonetheless, it's with them. So they have the garden there. So what's the next thing in the sequence? What's the next thing in the sequence? We can expect a fall moment. And that's essentially what we're getting to here, is the fall moment. So I want to set that up just to help us understand why this is so important, right? So let's move on through at least Joshua chapter 7 and a few brief points here. And then I want to compare this also to Genesis chapter 3 and Numbers chapter 13 and 14. Reason being is because there are certain words, phrases here that hyperlink us to those to help us appreciate what's actually going on here. So most of this is rather easy to work through. So even if you didn't go through all the rest of that sequence that I showed for you to your class, I think you could easily put this together without really having to strain too much or stretch them too far to a place perhaps where you all feel a little bit too uncomfortable. But to not highlight this in the sequence and just talk about the personal nature of Achan's sin and leaving it almost in the vacuum, not connecting it to these previous sequences, I think, of course, our students will appreciate the fact that this is a moment of sin and rebellion, but I think short changes the notion of why this was so important. So here, Joshua chapter 7, he has sent men from Jericho to Ai, and he's told them to go and to scout out the land. So the idea of going and scouting out kind of sends us back to not just the previous chapter in Joshua. My previous chapter, I'm talking about all the way back in chapter 2, when he sent out 2 spies to Jericho. No doubt the reason he's doing this is because he did that at Jericho. He's repeating the process just as part of his general military plan, strategy. But even the event in Joshua chapter 2 of those 2 spies still sends us back to Numbers chapter 13, when his predecessor and mentor Moses did the same thing in sending out 12 spies, one of whom was Joshua, into the land of Canaan to scout it out. Right? So going deeper into the context of Genesis chapter 2 and what's coming in the preceding context of Joshua chapter 6. Remember the command that Yahweh gave, that they should not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you do, you will die. That's unquestionably certain. And remember, we had Joshua tell these people multiple times, even the very moment before they lift their voices to shout, blow the horns for the walls to come down and commence in this battle to defeat Jericho. He told them very plainly that you are to keep yourselves from the things that are set apart, or you yourself will be set apart for destruction. We move on in the text of Joshua now to chapter 7, verse 1, and it starts off immediately with Achan taking some of what the Lord had set apart, and the Lord's anger burns against him. This is almost exactly how Genesis chapter 3 is set up, right? We have the serpent being who has entered the garden. Now, granted, Satan is not physically present in a way that we can tangibly appreciate. The text does not mention him anywhere. So certainly it could have been Achan's flesh that, of course, hates Yahweh just as much as everyone's flesh hates Yahweh. And as we all struggle with the idea of the fact we're broken human beings, and yet there's a compulsory component to our constitution that makes us want to rebel. Yet seemingly, Achan is the only one who has done this. Nonetheless, we have as one figure in Joshua chapter 7 who's blatantly disobeyed. It starts with one figure in the garden of Genesis chapter 3. And whether it's purely and only Achan's flesh or Satan working behind the scenes in the heart and mind of one to rebel, to bring a stumbling block to these people, the same consequence plays out either way. And the woman, of course, took some of the fruit and she ate it. Now this happened. Now notice the hyperlink in the text here. This is incredibly important. The woman saw that the tree was good, and so she took some of its fruit. And when Joshua interrogates Achan openly in front of everyone, this is what he says: "When I saw some of the spoil, among some of the spoils, a beautiful cloak, I coveted them," meaning he appreciated the fact that for him it was good, and then he should take it. And then he reached his hand forth and he took them. Moving on in Joshua. So this is what Joshua says when he sees the word back from the men that he sent out, as it was just a few thousand. It wasn't the entire army that he sent to go and take care of Ai, and then several wind up dying. And then when this happens, the people begin to wail and lament, and they're wondering what could have happened. It just doesn't quite resonate with Joshua, as he saw no blatant act of rebellion. And remember, he's walked through several blatant acts of rebellion on the part of Israel, starting with the golden calf. This was done openly amongst the people. It was not done in secret. Granted, Joshua didn't see it until he caught up with what was going on when he and Moses come down the mountain and he sees the people dancing on the calf. And then, of course, the rest of the story plays out. And then every other moment where we have Israel falling, these are open, public moments of people displaying disgruntlement and then willingly disobey Yahweh. In spite of the pleading, even by Joshua in the event of Numbers 14, when they rejected the plan to enter Israel and Canaan and seize it for themselves under Yahweh's headship and guidance, and watches the entire community become infected with the quick spreading metastatic cancer of the negative report of his fellow compatriots, the 10 spies who told everyone we can't do this. So because Joshua has not seen what's occurred here, I guess it just doesn't register with him immediately. Wow, somebody must have done something. This is the reason why we get lost. It doesn't make sense to him, and because of this, he begins to grumble himself and cry out loud to the Lord, "Why did you bring these people across the Jordan for our destruction?" Now, this is part of the reason why it links back to Numbers chapter 14. Now, it's not the first or only moment prior to this instance in Joshua where people are crying out to the Lord saying, "Why did you bring us out here to face the slaughter?" But this is a particular moment when this happens. So back to Numbers 14. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? So let me actually clarify a bit what I said a second ago. Many of these moments before Numbers 14, when the people are asking, "Why did the Lord bring us out here to die?" has to do with lack of food, lack of water, not because of a military conflict. And they haven't even faced a military conflict outside of what happened with Amalek. And the Lord delivered a decisive victory. There was no grumbling there that we have record of amongst the people of why has the Lord brought us here to just die? No, they take up sword and shield and then move out and then fight Amalek, and the Lord delivers victory. So now they faced other military skirmishes. Of course, the entire eastern side of the Jordan has been decimated, save the areas of Moab and Edom, that the Lord preserved because they are the distant relatives of the Israelites. But the kingdoms of the Ammonites and the Amorites, the Lord has delivered over Sihon and Og of Bashan, and they have completely decimated those areas and now even settled in there, right? So they've seen what the Lord can do multiple times in 2 generations. So for Joshua to be lifting his voice up like this, I think clearly hyperlinks back to this moment when he himself 40 years ago saw the people lament and wail, "Why has the Lord brought us to die by the sword? Because they're too cowardly to even attempt to try to go and enter into Canaan." So this also harkens back, though, to the moment in Genesis chapter 3, verse 4, even though the words are entirely different. But we recall what the serpent being said to the woman when he's questioning her. What did Yahweh say about the tree? So the woman tells him, of course, the day that we take from the tree, we will certainly die. The serpent being says, no, you're not going to die. So the point I make here is that the serpent is questioning what Yahweh has said and then has changed the truth of what Yahweh said to "you will not." Essentially, when Joshua is doing this, he's not necessarily embodying the spirit of Satan, but he is changing what the Lord has promised, because the Lord had given the command to Moses all the way back in Exodus chapter 3 to go based off the promise, I will come down and I'm going to bring them into a good, spacious land. Remember, Joshua has seen this in a literal way. Joshua, I would imagine now, as the leader and military commander of the people, is probably standing up at the head of the column as they are walking toward the Jordan River with the priests and the ark 1,000 yards ahead, as one of the first pair of eyes, aside from the priests, very near to see what's happening. That the massive river in its flood phase is now parting to allow them to go through it. He is physically watching with his own senses the fulfillment of what Yahweh said. I will come down to bring them into a good, spacious land, because Yahweh is bringing them into the land. No one is preceding him in that endeavor. So as Joshua has watched this, and now he is asking the Lord, why have you brought us here? Simply for our destructions, to change all of the promises and the very things that he has seen with his own eyes that Yahweh has performed, with questioning whether or not Yahweh is with him. Thankfully, Yahweh's anger does not burn against Joshua in this moment, but rather he is stern with him and tells him, "Stop crying, get up. Something has happened. Somebody has disobeyed me. Now it's time to root this out." And so, as part of that, Joshua deals with this by going through each of the tribes. Then, once one is isolated, each of the clans within that tribe until one house is isolated. That happens to be Achan. And so, once Achan is isolated, again, Joshua interrogates him to find out the truth of the matter. Then Joshua gives the instruction of how this is to be dealt with, and he brings him to the valley of Achor, presumably the name being changed to this as a play on words with the name of Achan, because of it will be a permanent memorial to the people of Israel of what the Lord did to Achan and his family, so that they would not dare repeat this episode. Brings him there, and then all Israel stones them to death. And of course, this is a very final act, as there is no redemption from this. There's no offering of sacrifice to try to repent. And there apparently was no throwing himself on Yahweh's mercy to escape the consequences of this. We don't know whether or not they pray for forgiveness, because it's not in store for us. But either way, they are not granted that. And because they are not, again, this is the consequence that they are dealt. Much in the same way, when we go back to Genesis chapter 3, we know the fallout there, that the Lord sent them out of the garden. And of course, Achan and his family are being severed from the garden completely, and left outside in permanent exile, the exile of death. And this was the same fate that awaited those 10 spies who convinced the people in Numbers chapter 14 to not enter the land. And those men who had spread the report, they were struck down by Yahweh. So I think it's important for us to connect these dots for our students, because, again, seeing how these previous sequences have played out and the severity of Yahweh's judgment against them helps frame up why this happened, because it's brought us to the precipice of yet another fall moment. Fall moment that happened in Genesis chapter 3 that becomes the microcosm by which all the rest of these stories that have similar moments are juxtaposed against. And the events of Numbers chapter 14 are no different, because that chapter starts off on a high note. They have made it to the border of the land. They are ready to go in to the provincial Eden. This corporate Adam is ready to take the inheritance that Yahweh has given them in spite of their rebellious moments against him. And then they choose to listen to the words of the serpent being who has enticed the hearts of these 10 men to say, Has Yahweh really said? Because it's tantamount to what they're doing. Is the Lord really going to bring us into this land? In our eyes and by our judgment, we would say no. There's no way he could deal with those people who are behind those high fortified walls in those cities. We are going to be utterly crushed, decimated. And because they led the people in believing the same lie, and ultimately it led to the demise of that entire generation. And this is a moment that stands to be very similar to now. Granted, the ultimate consequence was exacted upon Achan and his family. But imagine if this rebellion had went further, uh, meaning if they had chose not to meet this out against Achan and his family, instead chose to drive them out of the land, put them off into permanent exile. That is not apparently what the Lord wanted. He wanted them destroyed in this fashion, again, for a permanent memorial to the people of what will happen. Because it's going to be referred to over and over, much in the same way, while the events of the garden are not necessarily referred to. Nobody's calling out Adam and Eve in future instances of Israel's stories to say, don't repeat what happened in the garden. Nonetheless, we see that shadow looming long, touching many of the stories that will come after it. So the story of Achan will continue to permeate Israel's history, even into the time of the prophets, Isaiah and others, who will talk about how God is going to reverse the fortunes of what happened in the battlefield of Achor and wind up bringing prospering even to that area. So hopefully that was helpful. I do appreciate you listening. And now we'll see you hopefully in person next week for our time together on Wednesday. Thanks for listening.